Welcome everyone to today's ISN New Jersey webinar program. I would like to do a shout out to our other chapter members that are joining us today from Dallas, Nevada, Denver, Eastern Virginia, New York, and New Jersey, of course. Please be sure to use the chat and Q&A tab for any questions you may have for our speaker today. And please, we do ask questions. Please ask questions. Now, let's get started with our program. Our speaker for today is Ian Boyd. He is an associate director within Corcentric's Source-to-Pay Consulting Group, contributing to large-scale sourcing engagements focusing on delivering results in the MRO and facility management spend categories. Ian leads Corcentric's MRO and facility sourcing practice, managing a team of subject matter experts that typically operates as an extension of a sourcing team to deliver cost savings and operational improvements. He has 9 years of experience in strategic sourcing with expertise in the chemical, steel, packaging, and pharmaceutical industries, where he has negotiated agreements for direct materials, MRO supplies, contract manufacturing, and facility management services. Ian holds a Bachelor of Science degrees in chemistry and economics from the University of Pittsburgh and is a featured writer at strategicsourcer.com. At this point, I would like to welcome Ian.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate the introduction. Appreciate the, including me in this event. Happy to be here. Excited to talk about this. So thank you everyone for joining. Certainly appreciate it. As you can see, I am, as many of us still are, operating out of my home in Philadelphia. It's a beautiful day here, which is great, but anyone who spent time in Philadelphia knows that the minute the sun comes out and it starts warming up, so do the dirt bikes and ATVs going up and down Broad Street all day, every day. So, which is a lot of fun. But I will preface this call by saying I am in my home office and can't control the sound that's going on out there. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. And if I have to jump on mute for a second, that's why. But it hasn't been an issue today. So we'll keep our fingers crossed that works out well. So with that caveat, I'm excited to be here today to talk about circular supply chains, and really that's a tool specifically in this overarching theme of sustainability and even higher level corporate social responsibility. And what I want to talk about is utilizing this method and this model to drive cost savings, reduce risk, and just implement best in class sourcing strategies, procurement strategies. I'm a procurement guy. This is my focus really is in procurement. Obviously, this is going to seep into supply chain overarching. I'm coming at it from a procurement focus, so I'll add that caveat as well. But hopefully we can illuminate some positive change that can happen through some of these sustainability initiatives and show what procurement professionals and supply chain professionals can implement from it. Excuse me. So when we talk about circular supply chains, what we're talking about is this concept of sustainability. To lay the groundwork, we have to understand why is sustainability important and why should that be a strategic initiative. So, why should we as companies drive towards sustainability? And the first and probably most obvious answer is this idea of addressing environmental responsibility. And that can operate in, a lot of different ways. So at a micro level, thinking about how do we reduce pollution and waste directly generated from our processes. But then on a macro sense, talking about what's our impact in climate change and overall climate impact. And when we think about the tie into this idea of corporate social responsibility, and that's obviously become, the awareness around that topic has obviously changed quite a bit, especially in the last year and a half. So, there's tie-ins to ideas of, well, if there are negative externalities from our processes, what communities are those impacting? What are the larger social and environmental impacts that maybe we're not considering that are directly related to our production processes? So there's all these different ways of kind of tying it back to this idea of corporate social responsibility, and then you narrow it down into this idea of sustainability in the supply chains that we focus on here. So, another reason, customer demands and adapting to consumer preferences, particularly for sustainable products. So there's this question of, does sustainability drive demand and growth with our customers? And will customers be willing to pay more for a sustainable product? Or is there an opportunity for us to increase our margins or maybe charge a premium for a more sustainable product? And there's certainly increasing consumer preferences for sustainable products, though admittedly there's still a gap in purchasing patterns. Oh, sorry, jumping around. So sorry about that. There is still a gap in purchasing patterns. So, if you poll consumers, about 60% of them are going to say that, they want sustainability, they want more sustainable options in their products. But when you get to actually pulling the trigger and making purchases, only about 5 or 10% of those are actually going to pick the sustainable option if that's a higher cost. But over time, you're starting to see that consumer preference and some of those purchasing patterns increase. And we as companies need to think about ways that we're going to adapt to that requirement and that what customers are looking for. And then you get into this idea of resource scarcity, and this is something that ties really back to supply chain specifically, and just the general reliance on end-to-end supply chains. So when you think about, particularly for scarce products, what can we do to decrease our reliance on particularly single and sole sources, effectively increasing our supply through recycle and reuse programs, and just reduce our risk exposure in the supply chain. And then lastly, addressing regulatory trends. As governments start to adapt, and if government policy changes to address certain climate initiatives, we need to know what our tools are available to us in supply chain organizations to actually impact those. And so that, as I mentioned, that lays the groundwork for just why sustainability is important. But then we need to think about what's an actual tool available to us to address those initiatives. And that's where we get to this concept of circular economies. So as far as defining the circular economy, this is one of the slides I'll read verbatim because it actually applies in this case. But this is an exercise in rethinking our supply chains, how we structure our economies and minimize waste and incorporate sustainable practices. And the second point, and this is really kind of where I'm going to expand on, this includes rethinking both our inputs and outputs or waste streams, incorporating newer recycled materials, cleaner technologies, and new organizational and logistical practices. So, that last point is really important because you can see there's a lot of different facets that go into the consideration of what makes a process sustainable. And I'm probably going to lose half the audience here, but if anyone remembers the old, Bio 1 classes that you might have taken in college, think of the Krebs cycle or the photosynthesis cycle. Those always loop back, and we'll talk about what that ends up looking like in subsequent slides. But can we make our supply chains model those biological systems where there's closed loops, and we're bringing back as we're keeping as many of the inputs within the cycle as possible and bring them back to the start. So a lot of companies have begun to incorporate newer recycled materials, cleaner technologies, and those new organizational logistical practices, and to great effect. And this is just a quote that I think really succinctly talks about why this is important. Being sustainable, it's a business opportunity as much as it is a responsibility. Those two things aren't necessarily independent, right? So we have a responsibility as organizations to consider our impact and to improve our environmental impact, but that doesn't mean that there is an opportunity that's bred from that. So at this point, let's start talking about how letting this take shape. What does this actually look like? So in a typical end-to-end supply chain, we're looking at this linear model, and it's what we're all familiar with. You take something, you take raw materials, you manufacture them, send them out to customers, they use it, you throw it into the trash, and that's the end of it, and rinse and repeat. And then when you move into this idea of a circular economy, it centers around the reuse of products and raw materials, and then prevention of waste and harmful emissions into the soil, the water, the air, wherever possible. You're trying to close that loop. So what you're seeing here is this ideal closed loop system. And if you notice, in this perfect world, you're eliminating the disposal and pollution part of the process. So you're kind of you're eliminating the negative externalities. Realistically, you're probably not going to be able to do that at 100% yield. But the goal is to minimize those externalities. And if you can minimize the disposal and pollution pieces of this, bring that cycle back to the starting point as much as possible, you're on the right track. So talking a little bit about the benefits of doing this. The first one, and probably the most obvious, cleaner environment. The goal is to reduce waste, and you talk about what positive environmental impact that has by reducing waste and reducing emissions. Secondly, economic benefits and growth. So this is talking about aligning to consumer preferences. I mentioned that before. Is there a greater demand for sustainable products? Can we align to consumer preferences and kind of utilize this as almost as a marketing tool in some cases by utilizing some of these sustainable practices? Next is supply security. I referenced this before as well. Can we reduce the scarcity of supply by adding new ways to reuse and recycle raw materials, essentially just adding new raw material streams where they wouldn't have existed before, or we would have had, in some cases, single and sole sources. And then lastly, cost savings. And this is an important thing to highlight because there's always this underlying assumption that sustainability and environmental impact is going to come at a cost, and that doesn't have to be the case. And so I'll have an example or two later that talks about ways that cost savings actually there are ways that you can capture cost savings by implementing these strategies. It's not, in some cases it is going to cost more. I'm not going to pretend that that's true in all cases, but in a lot of ways, reusing product can take cost out, and you get all the benefits of cost savings while getting those previous benefits of the environmental impacts and that security supply as well. And that's where that ties back to the idea of reducing risk exposure. So as we're going through this slide might be the most important and the most robust one in the entirety of this speech. So there's a lot to cover here, but the idea here is when we think about sustainability, I think there's a tendency to think about recycling and to stay on the concept of recycling as the end all be all or the only option available to us. I've talked a lot about reusing raw materials, but that is one of, I've got 6 examples here that, that tie into this idea of sustainability. So what I want to do is go through each of these, give some examples of what this might look like, because there's just we have a lot of power and opportunity to affect change in the supply chain in a lot more ways than maybe we realize outside of just this idea of recycling. So this first one, rethink and reduce. And before changing the existing process, we need to think about the question of what's our customers' demand, right? So is the current model the right one to address that issue? So before even starting with whatever process we're talking about, production process, sales cycle, we need to work with product and process design teams to design for sustainability and make sure that we're addressing customer needs. And if there's opportunity to change the process to change sustainable solutions or implement sustainable solutions while still addressing the customer's demands, that's a really important thing to take into account early on. Similarly, this idea of redesigning. So, taking reuse, repair, the use of modular parts, and different production processes into account. And so an example of this that our group helped out with one time, we were working with a medical device company, and they were buying parts from all over the world, all these little widgets that, individually were not particularly large purchases. They would get shipped to the US, they would get assembled, put together. And if we looked at strictly trying to take out cost at a SKU level, at an individual item level, nothing that was in there was particularly large enough to be hugely impactful. So one of the things we went in, we decided to look at, well, how are you assembling your modular parts? And how does that A, affect your cost structure, and B, affect your shipping, your shipping methodology? So we ended up working with this company to change, to essentially sub-assemble a bunch of these parts in China before they got shipped over to the US. And that had an effect of a couple different things. One, you were optimizing your shipping schedules. So rather than getting these parts from all over the world and shipping at different times and having to account for where they are, there was a smaller number of finished SKUs that were coming into the US for that final assembly. And because we were able to assemble them elsewhere, we were able to negotiate better rates for the assembly itself. So there were cost savings associated with the change in process, while also savings from the logistical practices as well. And so it just comes from that idea of, if we had only looked at the purchase of individual products and, just did a very black and white assessment of, we're buying these SKUs and we're going to reduce cost on these, there probably wasn't going to be that much opportunity, and there wasn't really opportunity to change the process itself. So instead, we took a step back and said, well, let's look at the way we're assembling these products. Let's take a look at our production process, see if there's a different type of opportunity to address this. And then, there's suddenly you've got more cost saving opportunities. You've got these logistical opportunities to improve. And that whole redesign process, got us a lot further down the line than we would have otherwise. So another part of this is optimizing production processes. I come from the chemical world where, batch size is a really important metric and part of the production process. So you start thinking about, well, are we optimizing batch production? Are we scaling up appropriately? And if our production processes are optimized, we're reducing energy usage. You're still getting similar logistical benefits. That's kind of an underlying theme for a lot of these. And you're reducing man hours, and there's a lot of different reasons why that batch optimization or optimizing the production schedule really helps with particularly reduced energy consumption. Similarly, are there ways that we can redesign the process to incorporate renewable energy sources? And then lastly, can we change our inputs so we're using less materials and reducing our footprint? That one's pretty black and white, but are we designing for sustainability? Excuse me. Can we reduce some of the inputs up front and just reduce our impact from that perspective? So I'm going to keep moving on. Like I said, I know this is a dense slide. There's a lot to cover here, but there's a lot of good information here. So this idea of reuse. So considering the total cost of ownership of assets. So I come from the MRO world as well, and so that's a lot of bearings and filters and stuff like that, indirect materials that go into the production process, but maybe aren't the primary focus. But over time, those break down. They have to be replaced. So you have to consider the total cost of ownership of assets, because as those break down, you're paying to replace those. That's a costly, both from a direct cost perspective to replace those parts constantly, and from a sustainability perspective. Obviously, if something's breaking down more frequently and you're replacing it, you're using more of that product. So kind of designing for a longer lifespan. That's especially easier or something to consider for companies that are maybe in a better cash position that can make some of those upfront investments and are able to invest in products and technologies that have a longer lifespan and support the production process a little bit more. Similarly, this idea of repair and remanufacturing. Can we extend the lifespan of key production parts? Are we buying longer lifespan parts? B, are we doing everything we can to extend the lifespan through repair and remanufacture operations? So then we get back down to recycling, the original friend, kind of the start of this conversation, maybe the most obvious one, but is there opportunity for the actual product to be reworked and reintroduced into the system? Can we do anything with our waste streams that can be reused or even sold as a byproduct to another company? It might not be a product that we can use directly back in our process, but there may be a company right down the road, who has a different need for it, and suddenly your waste stream becomes a raw material for someone else. And then lastly, this idea of recovery, that mostly covers energy capture. So are there heat capture technologies that can be used to create more of a closed loop system, particularly in the energy space? And so when we think about what we can do as procurement professionals or supply chain professionals, again, I'm coming from a procurement world, we have to be stewards for these processes and consider the risks and the possibilities at each stage in the process, consider our inputs, consider the outputs, risks, and most importantly, the opportunities to address each of these processes or each of these opportunities in each stage of the production cycle or the sales cycle. That's we have an opportunity to drive those forward. Even if they don't necessarily fall on our team directly, we have a lot of power to drive that message within our teams. And I think back to that first stage, rethinking and reducing. It's not may not be our job to re-engineer the production process, but can we be a voice in the room to drive that idea? We should be. So I'm finally moving on from this slide. Like I said, that was a long one, but I want you to think about these 6 overarching themes. This next slide, it's convoluted somewhat intentionally, so don't feel like you need to capture everything that's on here. But what I'm showing here is basically an end-to-end production process. And you'll see in highlighted in green it ties back to some of those concepts that we talked about in the previous slide. So and point here is to show that at each stage in the production cycle, there's an opportunity to address something like reduce and reuse, creating closed loops where later down in the process we can loop back to earlier stages in the process through different mechanisms. So if you look up top, that idea of reducing and rethinking our inputs, that starts from that primary material production. But if you jump down into the user, suddenly is there a loop that can be made through maintenance programs? Or from the collection side, at the end of this cycle, it's either going into energy recover or landfill, and we want to minimize that landfill process. So is there an opportunity from the collection side to reuse waste streams, sending that back into the manufacturing process of the service provider? And so the overarching theme here, again, I would never expect anyone to look at or internalize every bit on here, but the overarching theme is we can link almost any later stage to an earlier stage with some creative thinking. And we have all those previous tools that we talked about available to us to make that happen. So I've gone on for a while about why this is the greatest thing in the world, all the things that we can, we're going to save the world by doing all this sustainable stuff. But what are the downsides? We have to be candid about what can really happen here. So the biggest one is this idea of increased interdependencies. So every actor in the circular economy, whether it's a company, whether it's a person, product, they're connected. Same way, similarly to a normal supply chain. Of course, we rely on our suppliers, but this creates a certain type of dependency that at a higher level, depending on how things are structured. So to take this into account, short and long-term consequences have to be considered, and the impact of the end-to-end value chain. So companies need to map current resource consumption and waste to identify areas of risk and regulatory exposure. This is implementing these circular supply chains. It can do one of two things. You can increase or decrease your sole source situations. If you are introducing a recycle stream where you had a sole source before, you're in essence adding to your supply. But at the same time, if you are recycling product and utilizing recycled product at a specification that is very tailored to your process, and there's only one company that's able to do that, you have essentially introduced a single source or a sole source into that process. That's something that needs to be considered. Doesn't necessarily need to be a showstopper, but it's something that needs to be mapped out and considered so that you understand or we understand what our risk exposure is at each stage in the process. So that covers theory. That was a lot of theory, but this is an example. This is a concept that is probably best represented through examples. So I have two examples I want to provide. One from more of a retail perspective, one more from an industrial perspective. So I wanted to show a couple different mechanisms or scenarios where this concept applies. So the first one is Ikea. And this was something that Ikea announced, I believe it was October of 2020, so relatively recent, where they announced a buyback program. And the idea was to incentivize customers to return products for resale and recycle. So essentially what they did is they said, hey customers, if you want to bring back old furniture, we'll give you a credit, and we are going to either resell those products or break them down, you turn them into recycled raw materials that we will then use for presumably for production of new furniture. And so it shifted this focus from consumption to sustainability, but they were still trying to drive growth. And the interesting subtext of this is they're actually probably increasing their customer retention. And IKEA is notorious for using about 1% of the world's wood supply each year. So that's a lot of bad press as more people start to get to know that. And there's a certain responsibility that company has to say, if we're using that much wood in a year, what are we doing to reduce our impact? And so this recycle program does that. They're able to essentially add a new raw material stream by recycling old furniture that they've sold in the past. But what this also does, and this is kind of that secondary business growth opportunity that's available through customer sentiment, suddenly you've increased your customer retention. Customers that you have sold to before, they're going to come bring back their old IKEA furniture, bring it back to the store. And oh, by the way, while I'm here, why don't I walk through the store and buy a couple of new things while I'm at it? So there's all these little benefits. You've reduced your waste. Well, you haven't reduced your waste, but you recycled your waste, decreased your reliance on this new lumber, and you've increased customer retention and brand loyalty because you are positioning yourself as this good corporate citizen. And so there's a bunch of different ways that this is beneficial. Still a new program. It'll be interesting to track and see what the results are and how they report on it. But a good example of how something like this might be applied in more of a retail scenario. So the next, and this one, I'll preface by saying this one's very in the weeds, but it comes from the world that I spent a lot of time in. So I mentioned before, I spent years in the chemical industry. And this is something that was very near and dear to my heart, with this idea of solvent reclaim. And so, what we're doing is capturing and reworking solvent waste streams for reuse and resale. And, solvents, if you think of paint thinners or something like that, solvents are nasty stuff, huge environmental impact. They're unsafe to transport in many cases. So, there's a lot of environmental impact to be considered. And this is another example where, you're utilizing dirty materials, but by creating one of these closed loop systems, it ends up being more cost effective. You reduce waste and reduce the need for new product. And it also demonstrates reverse logistics opportunities. So it's a really strong example. It's very in the weeds. So, bear with me as we go through this, but I'll tie it back to the overarching concepts at the end. So within a solvent reclaim process, if you're blending together solvents, you have the option of using the new stuff that's coming out of the refineries in Texas, typically Texas. A lot of the stuff originates in the Gulf Coast. And you blend that together, you repackage it, you sell to your customers. But these customers have these waste streams that can be recaptured. And what ends up happening is those waste streams get sent back to a reblending site, blended together with the pure stuff, and blended to a spec and then resold into the repackaging. And here's why this is so beneficial. You've reduced your costs in a big way. So those recycled waste streams tend to be 20 to 40% less expensive than those we call them virgin solvents. And you've also reduced your reliance on the manufacturer. So let me throw this up on the screen. So you realize cost savings by incorporating a lower cost recycled product into your process. You've decreased your reliance on manufacturers. And oh, by the way, the manufacturers often end up, certainly in this space, they're coming out of the Gulf Coast, and this is a commodity market. So, if there's one thing we're certainly familiar with after the last year, Texas, for example, is very susceptible to extreme weather. When I was working in the chemical industry, hurricanes would knock out refineries all the time, and you'd be scrambling for product. And you were lucky to get some. You had to have really strong risk mitigation strategies in place to make sure you didn't run out of product. And then, you look at what just happened in Texas with the cold front that came in, knocked out production in a big way. And if you were purely relying on the product coming out of those refineries and purely relying on the new stuff, the pure stuff, then you got screwed, frankly. But in this case, if you were able to incorporate recycled product coming from waste streams, in safer locations, especially, your reliance on that stuff coming out of the Gulf was less, and your risk exposure was less. So, I alluded to reverse logistics practices. Again, that's kind of an underlying concept through all of this. Those back and forth, the pickups between the customer and the reblenders, that's a back and forth where, that truck is full that whole time. So you're not wasting trips back and forth. And by optimizing those logistics strategies, again, you're reducing the amount of time on the road where you're not carrying product, and that's wasteful. And then lastly, and not to bury the lead, but you're reducing harmful chemical waste. Do we really want paint thinner or solvent blends dumped into the water supply, or not that they would be dumped in the water supply directly. This isn't some cartoon character, but this is nasty stuff. So the more of it you can reincorporate into your process, the better, and it reduces the waste in a big way. So those are two examples. There are many, many more. I wanted to give an industrial example and a retail example, just show kind of two different stages of the different industries and different kind of life cycle processes where this can be applied. And then lastly, we talk about implementation. So, we've talked about theory, we've given examples, but ultimately we need to be in a position where we can actually implement this stuff. And so how do we as procurement or supply chain professionals, how do we drive this forward, and how do we champion this through our organizations and make sure that they can actually be successful? So the number one, there's a reason this one is up top. And the number one reason or strategy that needs to be in place is this idea of organizational buy-in. So, rarely is sustainability going to be the easiest option, but it has to be a strategic initiative, and, to be able to work on a large scale. And that's especially true when cost isn't a driver. So if you can make a cost saving case for it, sure, that's fine. But it's not always the easiest option. And sustainability is a culture. So I think procurement leaders especially are trained to look at things pretty black and white. We're looking at things from a cost and a terms perspective, but we need to be able to change that perspective and empower procurement organizations and supply chain organizations to drive towards strategic initiatives. And then they have to be evaluated against those goals. So leadership really needs to establish their priorities and ensure accountability for this, circular economy initiatives. And organizations should engage business partners and customers to communicate those priorities too, because this doesn't have to be done in a vacuum. There are partners, customers can need to be a part of this. Think of that Ikea example. You still need your customers to bring back the furniture to be recycled. So, and there are partners, again, in the solvent example, there are those repackagers that need to be on board with this, where they're receiving the recycled waste streams. So, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Getting customers on board, getting supplier participants on board, and you can really kind of have this permeate through the end-to-end supply chain. Make sure it's sustained through multiple parties. But again, tying it back to the overarching theme, this needs to be an organizational goal. There needs to be organizational buy-in, and teams need to be evaluated based on consistently based on that priority. This next one, change management processes. So there has to be implementation of robust change management processes to map out existing processes and map out what you're moving towards. So, it needs to comprehensively address and document all opportunities and risks associated with each stage. So, I mentioned before, every stage is going to have something that needs to be considered. Who's where, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the risks associated with them? A robust change management strategy is going to be able to account for all those, and make sure that there are mitigation strategies, or just documented cost savings within each of those steps in the process. And then lastly, mapping current resource use and waste generation, and hedging risks. So understanding supply risks from more of a direct sense in terms of if something goes wrong, how are we covered? But then also thinking about a more regulated and demanding carbon reduction future. If we got out ahead of that work and we understand where our exposure is, if those policies change or if there is changing priorities or increasing pressure to drive towards sustainability, well, we've got this documented and we know where the levers we can pull as we start to drive towards that in the future. So next one, KPIs and measuring success. So this really ties back to this idea of organizational buy-in. So you get organizational buy-in, it's top down, everyone's going to be agreed to be evaluated based on the success surrounding implementation of sustainable practices. But then how do you measure that? It has to be clear, it has to be concise, it has to be consistent. So establishing KPIs and metrics, and that can be internally, and that can be with supply partners. But you have to align, with your suppliers. It can be through corporate governance, QBRs. If anyone's done scorecard exercises with suppliers, adding in KPIs and metrics related to sustainable practices, that's a good way to kind of force what's the word I'm thinking of? Prioritize end-to-end sustainable efforts with our supply base. And then internally, we can use metrics, some old metrics that are maybe more familiar, reducing waste to landfills, reducing CO2 emissions. Those are pretty well tried and true. There are new, more, kind of ever developing metrics as well. So percentage of reclaimed or reused materials, for example, in the production process, reduction of single-use plastics. So, that's a whole process of establishing what's a priority, how are we going to measure our success in this space, and then making sure we're tracking on that consistently and driving towards, clear goals. And again, that ties back into that organizational buy-in and making sure that your organization is clear on what you're trying to accomplish. Technology solutions. So, this is big because this is something that is ever changing. There's new technology available. There's greater visibility in the end-to-end supply chain for tracking, for visibility. We can see the impact of each input through the process, and this is especially true in reverse logistics. So, transportation management systems are really powerful tools, and a lot of them are developing ways to implement those reverse logistics strategies, which is a big part of, it's been that underlying theme, right? There's always opportunities for optimizing logistics strategies, and there are technology solutions available, and they're getting better and better to help support those initiatives. And then lastly, this idea of procurement strategies, and these are probably, I don't know how many people here are supply chain versus procurement, but again, I'm coming from a procurement perspective. There are those tried and true procurement initiatives that we're all familiar with, but they really feed into and support this idea of sustainability. So usage optimization and product elimination. If we're buying 10,000 SKUs, but we only need 1,000, that would be a pretty incredible jump to make. And give me a call if you're able to do that. But think of all the time and energy wasted, all the unnecessary shipments, the wasted warehouse space or stocking space when we're buying a bunch of products and from a bunch of different vendors that we don't need to do. It's so much easier to implement these sustainability practices if we've got our hands around product rationalization. And obviously we know as procurement professionals, when you bundle together volume, you're going to be able to negotiate better cost savings. You're going to have, in many cases, have better corporate governance, better relationship with your suppliers, where you can drive a lot of the sustainability efforts, and just the level of effort to try and manage through a lower number of SKUs. It pays a lot of dividends in a multitude of ways. Similarly, spec optimization, spec standardization, that kind of plays into that same idea, where if we can optimize our specs or standardize our specs and engineer towards more streamlined solutions as much as possible, we can focus in on some of those sustainability solutions and not be worried about all this tail spend, and not be worried about the supplier who's knocking down our door trying to get paid, because we have less of those to deal with. So good procurement practices, even at the core, the things that we're very tried and true familiar with, when we do those well, it opens us up to do a lot better work on the sustainability front. And so it's a nice way of marketing ourselves as procurement professionals and saying, look at all the externalities that we can drive when hey, our organization promotes us and works with us to drive good procurement practices. So the goal of this slide was just to go through tangible things. What are some of the ways that we can drive forward on sustainable ideas? how can we make them stick in our organizations? How can we promote them? So, hopefully that gives you a nice little flavor of some of the power that we have. And again, tying back to some of the earlier points I made, we have to be stewards of this process. Getting organizational buy-in is great, but in many cases, procurement and supply chain has a very wide purview and a very broad view of organizations and a lot of influence in tying those pieces together. So when we are in a position to promote that, we hold a lot of power to make it sustain. No pun intended. So with that, that's all I got for you. So, I certainly appreciate everyone's time and attention. I think we have some time for questions. Kathy, I'll defer to you at this point, but, certainly appreciate everyone jumping on and listening. And we were able to avoid the dirt bike concerns. So we got lucky today.
Thank you so much. I did notice that Elise had a raised hand. I'm going to allow you to talk, Elise, if you want to do your question live. Elise, you can unmute yourself and then you can ask your question.
I'm good, sorry.
Okay, no problem. I thought you had a question. Okay, if anybody has a question, please let us, you can use the Q&A or the chat, or if you raise a hand, I could also have you answer it live. Oh, it looks like we have a question here. Of the 6 implementation strategies, which do you feel are key?
Yeah, it's a great question. So above all else, you don't get anywhere if you don't have the organizational buy-in. So that top-down approach, if leaders in your organization aren't championing this, and it has to be consistent, right? So at the highest level, this has to be a top-down priority. So, and over a period of time. So, if this isn't driven from leadership and it's not evaluated consistently by leadership, it's going to fall apart. Because, like I said before, it's rarely the simplest or easiest to implement solutions. So getting that organizational buy-in is key. And I'd say the KPIs and metrics, those can take a lot of different forms, but, how are we actually measuring ourselves, and being clear about what we consider success? Because what you don't want to do is 6 months down the line, a year down the line, if you're looking at what you've done, we don't know what the actual impact was. It's hard to kind of justify the work that goes into it. So that organizational buy-in and then creating clear delineations on how you're going to be evaluated and making sure they're consistent. I'd say those are probably the 2 most important.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have another question in. In general, has the pharma industry been receptive to making changes, particularly with regards to packaging components, such as labeling materials?
It's a great question. So I would say that in my exposure, and I'll preface this by saying I only have my own exposure in the pharma industry, but there's always a drive towards, optimizing those procurement patterns. So this is sort of an implicit tie into the sustainability drive, but, optimizing relationships, packaging, reducing number of SKUs where it's possible. Those feed into sustainability initiatives, even if they're not explicitly stated as such. So my exposure with the pharma industry has been, they're always looking for good procurement practices, and there's certainly a tie into the sustainability idea. So but as far as sustainability initiatives as a whole, I'd say at least in my exposure, it has been more at the ground level.
Okay, we have another question in. For international supply chains, some countries are more amenable to protecting the environment than others. Which countries do you consider the best potential partners for sustainable relationships?
Ooh, well, that's an interesting question. It's a big question. So, there's always, I don't know that there is a particular country I have in mind. It's more related to the process itself. So, there's a lot of talk about nearshoring, reassessing, outsourcing. China is probably the country that gets thought of the most. Our companies moving away from China into Southeast Asia, for example. But what you really have to consider is kind of that total in a way, it's like a total cost of ownership of environmental impact. So if we're sending a bunch of stuff into Asia or into China specifically, what's our impact of shipping it across? And is there a better environmental case to be made for nearshoring it or reducing the shipping lanes? There are certainly countries that have looser environmental standards, certainly in the chemical industry. I'll be honest, there were products that we had to buy in some cases where you went into certain markets because they were the only ones that were willing to produce it. It's really just a matter of documenting that, understanding, within your specific process, what that impact is. I don't know that there's any one right or wrong country. It's more within your process. What's the impact of the shipping? The country that you're working with, how are they good stewards of the environmental impact that you're trying to make? So I don't mean to give a non-answer, but it's a bit situational, right?
Okay, it looks like we have Leo has just raised his hand. Leo, you can ask your question live now. Just make sure you're unmuted. Leo, you can talk now. Okay, I guess Leo's not going to be talking to us today. Okay, if there's any other questions, just please use the chat or the Q&A function, and we'll get that question over to Ian.
I would just like to say, first of all, thank you for this amazing event. But before I do continue, I do have some questions, but I wanted to ask quickly if there would be any ISM representatives that would kind of like vouch for my group, because we're in higher education, we're from Rutgers University, in our attendance for this event. Besides Mr. Boyd here, if we could just have like a basic contact email, that would be great. You can just put that in the chat for the end of the email. Some of the questions that I would like to ask Mr. Boyd would be the concept of circular economics. This kind of functions on a non-perfect basis, correct? Because are we executing these concepts with the assumption that there was never a true possibility of like a 100% perfect circular economic cycle? There always needs to be some degree of unrecoverable or unusable waste, correct? I think like maybe a good example would be in the Ikea example that you laid out. Certain furniture will never be viable for buyback, even for harvesting of raw materials, because it is too far beyond repair. So what do companies do to even further implement circular economic supply chain processes?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I thought about this leading into this. Could I come up with an example that approached 100%? And even in the most generous examples, you're still going to get energy externalities, right? There's going to be energy, even with, if you can do heat capture and implement renewable energy sources, chances are you're not going to be able to get to 100%. It's just not realistic, but you do your best to capture, get that percentage as high as possible. And so, it really just comes back down to that tracking and being honest with impact. What's our yield? Do we have a number that we can associate with sustainability, and what actually goes back into our program? Are we recouping 50% of our raw materials through reusable sources? Can we get that number? Are there methods to drive that number up? And so all those different, if you remember those 6 kind of design processes I went through, when you track, if there's opportunities to implement those at each stage in the process, companies just need to consider all those options and try and drive up that kind of that yield number to make it more sustainable.
Leo,
Thank you so much.
Do you have any more questions, Leo?
No, that's okay for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. I actually will do a shout out now, because I would like to welcome the group from Rutgers University that joined us today. And I believe we also had a few students from Temple University as well. So we thank all of our students for attending this program today, a very important program. So
Hi to the Temple students from South Philly.
so thank you so much for joining us today. Ian, do you have any closing thoughts before we end the segment?
No, thanks for having me. Thank you to everyone who's attended. I've included my email. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Happy to answer any additional questions. If you just want to say hi, happy to do that too. So, don't be a stranger.
Oh, thank you so much. By any chance, could you send me the slides that I could send out to the, okay. So everybody will get a copy of the slide presentation. This is being recorded, so you will also get the link to the recording in case anybody had to leave early or came in late. And I just want to do another thank you to Ian for this very, very informative presentation today. And I'd like to thank also Corcentric for all their support for all the presentations they've been giving us over the last couple of years. At this point, I'll say thank you for everybody attending, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.